This is kind of a video about my videos. It's a response to a few questions concerning my actual reasons for making these videos. And it goes back quite a while to when I first started to talk about the issues of life affirmation versus life denial. And why I'm actually doing it. It's an issue that's fascinated me for as long as I can remember actually thinking about the big issues, you know, life, the universe, and everything. I've always been interested in this. And again, I come at it, if anyone would make the connection between my nickname, my YouTube nickname, and, you know, this discussion. I come at it from the point of view of philosophical life denial versus philosophical life affirmation. And I wear this Om around my neck, even though I don't believe in God or anything like that, which refers to my interest in Eastern philosophies. Anekantavada is a Jain, or not necessarily limited to Jainism, but it's in Jainism, it's central to it. But Jainism has been characterized, and I think it's accurate, as a life-denying philosophy. One could apply that to Buddhism and even Hinduism, Christianity, ultimately all of them, Islam. The only one that seems to be more life-affirming than life-denying, as far as I can see, is Judaism. But it isn't really anti-natalism that interests me. I've said this repeatedly, and I know that it doesn't look like this sometimes, but I really don't have an issue with anti-natalism. It's not something that I find a dangerous philosophy or anything. I can see it as toxic to certain people who are struggling, say, with depression or with issues like that, or perhaps not toxic, but not conducive to recovery, if recovery is indeed what they seek. So it's not so much the idea of what we do with an anti-natalist view of the world. It's just I tend to like to deal with the arguments. I tend to like to deal with the reasons why people seem to come to an anti-natalist conclusion. And it's interesting in that there's always an undercurrent of life affirmation in just about every major tradition. In the West, it's kind of the occultish, kind of left-handed, one might even characterize it as satanic view of things, where the Satanists, if you ask me, go too far, because they flip things on its head, and they say bad is good and good is bad, or some of them do, I presume. I've actually never really studied Satanism. But there's kind of parallels in Eastern philosophy between the orthodox schools of Hindu and Jain and Buddhist philosophy and the heterodox ones, or the unorthodox ones, or almost anti-orthodox ones. The Sanskrit word is astik, which means they acknowledge the authority of the Vedas, but it just essentially means orthodox. And then there's nastik, which to this day is kind of an insult in India, which means heterodox or unorthodox or counter movement. And that's often applied to atheists or tantrics or whatever. The school of Eastern philosophy that fascinates me most is Tantra, and I engage in practices which are broadly fall under the rubric of Tantra, which is basically just yoga, meditation, and certain types of meditation and a certain outlook. The Orthodox schools, and I think that this goes for just about every major world religion and philosophy, is life-denying. Buddhism means getting off the wheel of existence. Jainism means the same thing. Christianity, Islam they say, you know, pile your treasures in heaven, don't consider the ones here. Tantra says, no, wait, there's things about the world, things about existence that interest me, but I know that the world is full of snares, and I know that the world is full of it's full of illusions, and you have to sort of deal with each and every one of the arguments that the quote-unquote life deniers make. And what you come up with is an interesting view, whereas you're not where you're not so much trying to get off the wheel of existence as you're trying to understand it and perhaps enjoy it, like a circus ride, roller coaster ride, or something like that. Now, where I find the anti-natalists useful is they have, or at least the type that I see on YouTube, or some of them, they have forceful, aggressive arguments as to why that is not only an incorrect point of view, riding the tiger, understanding what reality is, understanding what you are, what I am, etc. But there's all kinds of shoulds put on it, oughts put on it, that kind of thing. Now, that ought is what fascinated me from the very beginning, and it really put the hook in me, I have to confess, because that is something that had never actually come up before to me. It's not just the world isn't worth having kids in, it's you're actually doing something immoral by breeding. Now, that fascinated me, and it's almost like a ready-made foil for all my cogitations. And as you see, I don't often directly engage the more strident antinatalists, the forceful antinatalists, the ought-based antinatalists, or guilt-based antinatalists, or whatever you want to call them. But I tend to sort of deal with their objections as they come up, as they arise. To me, philosophy is something that means something. It has real life applications. It has real life meaning. And it has direct implications on the central sort of gist of what essentially is my philosophy of life. And my philosophy of life is based upon an answer to the question, is life worth living? And I've reached the tentative or provisional conclusion that life may not be inherently worth living. It may not be inherently not worth living. It's sort of the enigma in Socrates' saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. What does he mean by that? Well, he examines his life, or he examined his life, which made it worth living. The implication is most people don't examine their lives, so their lives are not worth living. And that's an interesting point of view. If you examine your life, if you attempt to understand what you are and what the universe is and what's going on around you and what reality is and how it works. In other words, when you try to understand what you are and what the wheel of existence is, if you want to use Eastern metaphors, which I use a lot of, and that kind of throws people off sometimes because it sounds like I'm pushing religion when I'm not, or at least I don't think I am. That's an interesting thing. It goes back to the cave. Most people are in darkness. Some people are in the light, even though going out into the light is enough to blast your mind out, which, again, Zopfi says it is. Or the Gita says it is. Or there are elements of this even in Christianity. The book of Ecclesiastes seems to say the same thing. The more you learn, the more it hurts, the more reality can sting you when you find out about it. Again, that's why the type of life affirmation, or I wouldn't call it necessarily life affirmation, but tiger riding that I engage in, which is Tantra, is so full of horrific imagery of demons and terrifying gods and blood-smeared swords and all this kind of thing, because you're essentially turning everything on its head, the better to actually see it for what it is, rather than recoiling from what is normally seen as the ugliness of existence. Tantra is a means by which you can stare directly into it and try not to be wiped out by it. stare right into the primal horror of everything and understand that it isn't really a horror at all. The horror is in here. It's something you are projecting onto that kind of thing. The image, of course, of Mother Kali comes to mind, where you have this many-armed, blood-smeared goddess that looks ferocious and aggressive and is constantly surrounded by violent images of decay and death and disease and all this kind of thing, and violence and bloodshed and strife and all this, generally the negative stuff. And yet when you get right down to it, the more, I would call it, rarefied heights of that kind of Indian thinking, I guess you'd call it Shaktism. It says that once you understand what Mother Kali, who is essentially the universe, really is, she actually isn't as terrifying as you think. And in fact, she's actually wonderful and beautiful, but you yourself have to learn to love her. You have to sort of see beyond the appearances to what she actually is. You have to sort of overcome your original revulsion. I mentioned Satanism early on in this video. Now, I've never really gone into this, but let's say that Satanism is kind of the unorthodox or left-handed or Gnostic version of Christianity. You just say the word Satanism and click, something happens in most people's minds, and they either go, forbidden, don't even think about it, or, just one of those two. That's kind of the way that Tantra is seen in India as well. Not quite to that extent, but, if you've ever heard of things like the Agoris, who allegedly engage in ritual cannibalism and, drinking alcohol out of human skulls and all this kind of thing. You understand why people might think that the Tantrics are pretty insane, but most of the Tantrics just do nothing more than what I do, basically. They engage in thought experiments, meditation. They try and alter their perceptions of things, that sort of thing. It's not, there's nothing inherently insane, at least, about what they overtly do. It's just, they're just sort of trying to train their minds to see reality in a certain way, to sort of come to terms with the fact that there's apparently a great deal of ugliness in the universe. And we want to know what that ugliness is and if it can be transformed, I guess. And that's why I talk about things like hupolepsis and agency and this sort of thing, because it seems to actually be the case that we can transform these things by sort of by controlling our preconceptions. In other words, the unexamined life may be not worth living, but if you examine your life, and if you examine your life in a certain way, it can be made to be worth living. But the thing is, people who have actually, it's been my experience that people who are actually living a life that isn't worth living simply haven't examined their lives. It's not really a case that, as Benatar would put it, people's lives are worse than they think they are, which they may be, I don't know. But it's that they're not even asking the fundamentally necessary questions. Is my life worth living as an individual? Is my life, my unexamined life, really, when I get right down to it, worth the bother? Now, that's what I think is actually taking place. And again, I have no way of knowing this. I just sort of seem to be, convinced of this based on the fairly superficial viewing of the evidence, that most people don't examine their lives. I look at their lives and I say, I don't want to live their lives. I really, truly do not. There's almost nobody in this world that I envy. I'm lucky, I guess, in that regard, or maybe it's just the way I've trained myself to think. Envy doesn't really occur to me very much. But I look at everybody else's lives and I sort of think, these people have nothing to teach me. They're not setting an example I would want to follow. I'm not terribly interested in living their life. And in fact, I almost certainly would not want to be who they are. But I like being who I am. And I like the fact that, as a lot of people I know tell me, that I overthink everything. That's why I have that silly icon doing this, is I'm just sort of poking fun at my tendency to overthink everything. And when you're right down to things like, is life worth living, a lot of people will say you're overthinking everything. There was English jackass walked up to a guy in the street in one of his recent videos. It's kind of funny, and he's asked him, "Is life worth living?" Or is it moral to have kids? And the guy just laughed. I said, "What?" That's what most people are going to say. It's most people. I wouldn't say, from my perspective, it looks like they're living in darkness, but from his perspective, the guy in the street, he's not living in darkness. To me, he's in the Matrix, and he doesn't know that he's in one of those cubicles suspended in this amniotic fluid or whatever it is, with the tube down his throat and in the back and all through his body and everything. He doesn't know that he's in that state. To me, it looks like I am still in there with, in my own little capsule, but at least I'm aware that I'm in there. I don't know if that's really the case, but it looks that way from where I'm standing. So, in short, the reason why I'm so fascinated by this, and the reason why I'm flogging this issue to death, isn't so much that I've got something against anybody who's an anti-natalist or pushing it or anything. This idea of self-examination fascinates me more than I can explain to anybody. I've always wanted to do what English jackass does and just walk up to people in the street and collar them and say, "Do you understand what this means to exist? Do you understand what all this is? Okay, has you ever thought about that? Have you ever looked up at the sky and really thought about the fact that never ends? It just goes on forever. It's not just some canopy up there suspended a few miles above our heads the way most people seem to think it is. I've never done that before. I used to do it in my younger days, not quite as randomly as he did. But, I used to engage people randomly in these discussions. And what you do is people just think that you're insane, which may be the case. I don't know. And from their perspective, perhaps I am. I don't care. Because as I say, I don't particularly envy their way of living. If I'm insane, then I'm kind of glad that I'm insane by their definition of insanity. So, as I say, it's not a case of whether or not life is inherently worth living. I'm willing to allow that it may not be. I don't have an issue with that. That doesn't terrify me at all. That existence might not be worth it. In and of itself, as a hand that you are just dealt, that you're just on the receiving end of what happens and you have no input in anything. That's why I'm dealing right now with hard determinism, because that does seem to be implied in Benatar's Symmetry, that we live in a hard deterministic universe because of the experiences that he puts together. Suffering and pleasure. Those are things that just happen to us. We are on the receiving end of those. Whereas the other ones that are less clear are things like agency, joy, love. We have control over these things, or some control over them. We have control over whether or not we can engage in these things or look at things in this way. I mentioned in my 100+ videos that I originally made on anti-natalism and depression that we do seem to have some control over whether or not we are depressed. We can think ourselves into a depressed state. I did it myself. A lot of young people in their late teens, early 20s who overthink everything end up in that mess. I thought my way out of it. I came to the depression a lot quicker than it took me to get out of it. It took me a decade to get out of what it only took me 4 or 5 years to get into. It may have taken me longer to get out of it, and I may not actually still be out of it. But from where things are now, I seem to have actually grasped the reins, and at least life is better than an equilibrium for me. It's better than just existing. I see people that say that life is basically just a deficit, and all of the good things in this world are just dealing with the deficits inherent in life. Well, I just don't buy that, because there's other things in life besides pleasure and suffering. And you can't really measure what the deficits or what the pluses are as neatly as a lot of people seem to say you can. Which gets back to the basic premise. Is life worth living? Do we have the right to bring others into this universe? Well, I said, do we have the right to do anything, first of all? Secondly, They sort of say, okay, it's all very well for you to make your life worth living, but what gives you the right to impose that on somebody else? Well, I would simply counter that with what gives them the right to think that they have, that life is to be just handed to them as a full, complete thing that they can accept or reject. I have had to do the hard elbow grease kind of work, the hard lifting, to sort of make my life worth living. So why shouldn't someone else have to do that? Do you want your life to be worth living or not? Or do you want to prove that it isn't worth living? The choice seems to be yours. That's why I'm dealing with agency. If I'm going to bring a life into existence, then I have certain, perhaps, obligations. And I accept those obligations as a parent. I am now a parent. But I also sort of say, it's not just up to me. I have had to intervene in my own life to make my life worth living. Any offspring that I produce will have the same obligation on them. I have obligations towards them. They have obligations towards themselves. Do they have obligations towards themselves? Well, that's for them to answer, right? They could all just fold their arms and say, nope, no obligations towards myself. I'm just on the receiving end of this. I didn't ask to be here. I have no responsibility for making my life worth living. Fair enough. I say that's a decision. If you want to make that decision, that's fine. That's up to you. But you have to accept the consequences of taking that point of view. If we're going to talk about what my responsibilities are, then I'm going to talk about what your responsibilities are. It's just, you can't point to everyone else's obligations and say, I don't have any obligations at all. I'm off the hook here. In many ways, I won't say in all ways though, but in many ways, human misery is self-created. And you have to sort of get out of that kind of thinking that just sort of leaves you there spinning your wheels in the mud. Now, nobody else can do that for you. You have to invoke your agency to do it, if you ask me. You're born with that agency, if you ask me. Even Benatar seems to imply it, that we have agency and we have certain choices that we can make. He says we must choose not to breed. Even though he implies that we don't have any choices. There are people out there who say we must choose to breed, not to breed rather, even though we don't have any choices. Now that's nuts. But, what it means to me is they're sort of contradicting their own premise that we don't have any choices. So we do have choices. We do have choices even per the more morbid, negative, anti-natalist, Benatarian, Zapfian types. We're not just passive victims of the universe. We have some input. Now, if I have some obligations towards other people's well-being and welfare, they have commensurate obligations, maybe not to me, but they have obligations to themselves. If I have an obligation, say, for example, towards my son, towards his well-being, his happiness, his ataraxia, his enjoyment of life, his quality of life. If I have obligations towards his quality of life, then he has obligations towards his quality of life. That's the way I look at it. It's not simply a case of obligations going one way. I was brought into this universe completely helpless before its insanities, and I have no obligations in terms of my own experience of it. It's just, I was forced to be here and I don't want to be here. Well, okay. That I would call another choice. That is also implied in Benatar. He implies that we have an obligation to make certain choices. The choice not to breed. I will counter his implication with an implication of mine, which is kind of my usual material conditional. If I have an obligation towards my son's well-being, he has an obligation towards his own well-being. That, to me, kind of deals with the question, is life worth living? It deals with everything if you ask me in the asymmetry or in the alleged asymmetry. It deals with all the oughts, if you ask me, all the oughts that Benatar implies. He says, we have the obligation not to breed, okay, to make that choice. I would say that's fine. But if I have an ought, then there are other oughts that go onto that which is bred into existence. If I have oughts, they have oughts, which actually either balance or cancel each other out. There's a symmetry there. I have obligations to others, others have obligations towards themselves. Does that make sense? I think that it does. If I have no obligation towards myself, then who has obligations towards me? There's something almost religious in that, right? I'm a helpless victim of God, of a rapacious deity that has brought me here and doesn't really give a damn about me. Do I give a damn about myself? Or do I just have a whole pile of arguments that ultimately contradict each other or whatever to explain why I'm stuck here? Now, that's interesting, and that's why I continually bring things like existential panic and depression and horror and all that into everything. All that stuff is there, but my assimilation of all the horrors of existence are in many cases in my control. Many cases, or in some cases, they are in my control. I can teach myself, I can inure myself to them, and I can, so many people say, make myself love them, transform them that way. If you opt not to do that, then I would say you are remiss in an obligation that you have towards yourself. That's why I'm so fascinated by this. I can think of few questions more fundamental than that. What does it mean to exist?